Welcome to The Plain Truth. I'm your host, Plain, and each week we try to explore some of the mysteries and anomalies in the financial underbelly of the world around us. Joining us this week is Jim Willie, who's quite well known for his discussions in the financial markets and such, and a couple of friends, Gigi and Oolong Rabbit. Jim, are you there?
I'm here. Glad to be with you.
Thank you much for coming. And Gigi and Oolong, are you there?
I'm here.
I'm here, Plain.
Good morning.
Well, let's get going for the ride. So, Jim, why don't we start out and say a little bit about you and your website? You've got a financial newsletter, and you've been around for quite a while, and a background in, I guess you would say, accounting and some of the numbers crunching in this dirty world we live in, right?
My background is a PhD in statistics, not accounting. So my background includes professionally quality control, marketing research, and sales forecasting and analysis. It's a statistics degree, heavy in probability, modeling, a lot of computer usage, programming, stuff like that. But it served as an excellent background for doing this difficult five-dimensional marketing research regarding the bond market, the bank systems, currencies, gold, and a good deal more interlaced with some queer politics, the geopolitics. So my newsletter is 9.5 years old now. In April, it'll be 10 years. That's amazing, 10 years. It's called The Hat Trick Letter, and it's found on the website www.goldenjackass.com. I'm happy to get my word out. It's interesting that after about 3 or 4 years, I started to develop more contacts that turned out to be extremely valuable. People who said, "Hey, Jim, I do this. Let's start sharing information and opinions and whatever. And, I hear things, you hear things. Let's put our heads together." But then in the spring of 2008, I had a significant increase in my contact base. I call him The Voice. And he's an international gold trader with contacts and billionaires all around the world. And he's turned out to be a very valuable tip source. Not just tips, but here's what's going on the next couple of years. Here's what's happening right now. Here are some of the big players. Here's who's being pushed out. Here's the new guy. And they were involved in doing a lot of things in the last year, and many of them are not in the news. That's what's kind of funny. I find that the gold community, which is what I serve, this is a gold-based newsletter. It's about the death of the dollar and the return of the gold standard, simply put. But a lot of the gold community, I find, doesn't know much about what's going on in the gold industry. They know about mining, and they know about the mints and coins, and they know about the regulatory corruption with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And they know a lot about the big banks and their net short position. But they don't know jack, S-H-I-T, about what's going on in the Eastern hemisphere for pursuing dollar alternatives. And that's where I think I shine. Russia and China are leading an effort. They're the new leaders of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. I asked once, why South Africa got put on the list of BRICS? And I got a simple answer. Well, because they have a lot of gold supply. All right, so that's what the BRICS are going to be all about. And the U.S. government can interfere with the G20 meetings. They've done 2 in a row now interfering, one in Ankara, Turkey, and one in Moscow, Russia. But the BRICS will continue. The BRICS will make their gold trade standard, and that will be the death blow of the dollar, and we will see the United States slide into the third world. I don't mince words. When the dollar dies, the dollar is rejected, the dollar must be devaluated, you're going to see tremendous inflation, shortage, and violence in the United States. And it's going to slide into the third world. It's already rather deindustrialized, if you'd noticed. So that's a little bit. The Hat Trick Letter has 2 parts. It's got a money war report. It's got a golden currency report. They're very separate. The money war report is about big actions on central banks, phasing out of the dollar, petrodollar issues. The golden currency is about actual demand and actual supply. Sometimes I cover some things about the mining companies and the competing currency wars and just, nuts and bolts of central bank policy and what's being enacted, and China pursuing their yuan swap facilities, and there's a lot of things. The hodgepodges in the golden currency report, the main major conflict at war is in the money war report. So that's background, Plain, and hope that satisfies.
Well, I saw you had an interesting article out in the last day or so, and then you had one not more than a few days before that kind of get into the question of Saudi Arabia, some of their problems, whether they're leaning towards China, and I think you even mentioned maybe the quality of their oil is declining significantly. What are you hearing in terms of Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia is in a bind. Their people really don't like the Islamic rules. It's basically an Islamic fascist state. I mean, we like to say that the United States has a lot of high-quality partners and allies. We got a lot of junk allies. We got a lot of criminal allies. The Saudis are a bunch of, a couple hundred, 300, 600 princes and royal family members who basically steal the national wealth and billions of their nation and call it their own, and have yachts and have 100% silver Rolls-Royce Bentleys and have secret accounts in Switzerland, and basically rob their nation blind and throw pennies on the street for their pathetic people. And their people are suffering from a number of problems. Feeding themselves, their energy costs are going up, and they don't like all the rules. They got between 20 and 40,000 people in their prisons right now just for speaking out against Islam. All right, apart from all that, I think that it's pretty clear the Saudis are the epicenter of the petrodollar. And if you ask 10 Americans, or you ask 100 Americans, what's a petrodollar? I think you get a blank stare out of 95 of them. And the other 5 might say something half intelligent about the petrodollar. Well, I think that's where the, a lot of OPEC countries sell oil in dollars, and that's, I think, the petrodollar. Okay, you get a lot of dumb responses and blank responses. The petrodollar is the operating foundation for the U.S. dollar as a global currency reserve. Nations accumulate dollars so that they can buy oil, whose rules by OPEC are dictated by Saudi Arabia. As these nations collect and accumulate dollars, they do so in the form of treasury bonds. So they collect the treasury bonds and put them in their banking system, and decided long ago, back in the 70s, to make the reserve system for banking across the entire world, most of the Western world, in treasury bonds. So the Saudis enable the United States to live off a credit card. It was John Connolly 30 years ago who said, it's our reserve currency, but it's your problem. Meaning that the United States can build up debts and just shove it down the throats of the rest of the world and say, you must finance it with treasury bonds because it's in your banking system as its foundation and backbone. So trade has dictated reserves management in the banking system. The petrodollar is key to it. And I think that because it just can't survive. The U.S. finances are very weak. Our $1 trillion, I made a forecast in late 08, early 09 that we're going to have consecutive $1 trillion deficits. And that turned out to be the case. I got a string of very big forecasts. I got about 19 or 20 big correct forecasts since 05 and 06 and 07. I got 1 or 2 that are incorrect. So if the U.S. has deep financial debt problems, and relies on the Fed and its monetary inflation and that QE. I hate the name QE. It's hyper monetary inflation. That's what QE is. So if U.S. government has to rely on hyper monetary inflation and bond monetization, meaning print money, buy the U.S. Treasury bonds, print more money, buy more Treasury bonds. It's 40 billion or 80 billion a month. I think it's more like 200 billion a month if you count all the derivatives that they monetize, like interest rate swaps. So the petrodollar cannot survive with the U.S.
Jim, a quick question with this, though. I mean, we know about the petrodollar, right? Perkins, in his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, he's in interviews talked about he was part of the deal that made the petrodollar set up. But I guess, isn't it being, or hasn't it been replaced in a sense with the tomahawk dollar standard? In other words, the U.S. controls the sea lanes with aircraft carriers and satellites and things like that. And that really, it's just pure force at this point, not as much oil, because the oil market is much, much more diversified now than it used to be, right?
Yes, I wouldn't call it the Tomahawk standard. I would call it the SWIFT standard and the aircraft carrier standard.
Well, that's what I meant. I said aircraft. It's really the aircraft carriers that have done the trick.
Well,
unfortunately, Russian missiles are so darn good these days, the standard looks like it's running into trouble.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the Tomahawk in the 80s and early 90s was the premier missile that ruled the roost, and that's not the case anymore. In the late 90s and right around 2000, there were some demonstrations for the Russian Sunburn missile. And, I've got a couple of really good friends, and they're smart people. And they told me back in August of 2004, we're going to have a war against Iran, Jim, and you better be better ready for it. And you better, talk about it in your newsletter. I said, no, there's not going to be any war. Have you ever heard of the Sunburn missile? And they said, no, what's that? I said, what's the reason why there's no war? It's the Peacemaker missile from Russia. Then in August of 2005 and August 2006, August 2007, August 2008, always seemed to be the end of the summer. I got the same kind of messages from the same group of friends. Well, we haven't had the war yet, but we're going to have it this summer, this winter, this autumn. And I said, why? Did the Sunburn missile go away? No, but there's going to be war. You'll see. And I keep telling him, no, you'll see. The Sunburn missile has now a big brother called the Onyx missile, ONYX. And these two missiles are faster and more accurate and have longer ranges than the cruise missile, which has not been upgraded. I hate to say it, but we seem to be full of amateurs running U.S. foreign policy, and we're coming up against a fierce Russian wall. And the Saudis are coming up against the same Russian wall. I don't think the Saudis are pursuing China. I think the Saudis are arguing with the Americans, running up against fierce Russians, and will fall into the Chinese hands. The Chinese have big petrochemical projects already. It's been a year now since their big project right off the Red Sea. It's on western side of Saudi, not the Gulf, not the Persian Gulf. So there's already a significant amount of Chinese yuan floating in through commerce. I think the Saudis are very soon going to announce that it's perfectly fine to sell our oil and receive money in payment with Chinese yuan. They're already taking some euros, not much. They're taking some yen, not much. Some British pounds, not much. But I think it's going to just all fall apart pretty soon because the Saudis are pissed off. Now, if you're wondering, gee, who's responsible for what's going on in Syria? It's largely Saudi Arabia. If you follow up by wondering, who's responsible for the chemical weapons usage in Syria? The answer is Saudi Arabia, our allies. And where'd they get it from? From a British corporation. And what's reported on the news? Well, the Western-dominated news calls it the Syrian loyalists. Well, I think it would look bad if they told the truth and said that it was the Saudis.
Well, I think we know that. I mean, at least listeners to the show are going to be pretty much well aware of that. I think the question is more, well, one obvious question is, have the Saudis lost their minds? The two factions or whatever, the Faisal and then the Bandar Bush faction are who hate each other. I mean, you could argue that they're angering Russia, threatening the Sochi Olympics and so on, right? Then they're having a hissy fit with the U.S. And this whole war would be incredibly devastating to China if oil prices were to double, right? I mean, the whole thing is a total losing deal for China. So even though China wants to buy into Saudi Arabia, you have to think that, I mean, what do you think? Have the Saudis kind of lost their minds?
I don't think they've lost their minds. I think they lost their control. I mean, some people would regard that as being the same thing. They're crazy. What are they doing? Well, they lost control. They're making bad decisions. I don't know if they're crazy. I think that, well, first of all, Abdullah, the king, is, gosh, he's 80-something, and there are reports that he never came out of a back surgery about 6 or 8 months ago. Well, apparently he came out of a coma. I'm not even sure Abdullah is Abdullah. I think it's possible that there might be a double involved, because I don't know anybody who comes out of a coma where a significant number of organs were dead. If you got liver that's not working, kidneys that's not working, and something else, brain functions are not working, you can be on automatic in a hospital, but I don't think you walk away and say, hey, look, I'm flexing my muscles, I'm kicking up my heels, and all's well. You know.
Hey, Jim, it's just a coincidence, right? It's, you know, unless you want to be a conspiracy theorist like the rest of us. No, that's a very good point. I mean, we can't be sure that the guy's alive, and that royal family is such a ridiculous thing to begin with. And then some are arguing that a lot of the oil is in the Shia parts of Saudi Arabia. And so there's an internal Sunni Shia issue as well.
They've got a lot of internal issues. It's not just their border issues. They got huge internal issues. Their people are fed up with the Islamic fascists. They want to, their women want to wear a bikini on the beach. You know what I mean?
Yeah, believe me, I'd
like them to wear a bikini on the beach too. But we need to talk about what's going to happen with this petrodollar.
Yeah, exactly. The bigger issue is what's going on. In your writing, you've talked about kind of a gas standard or a Gazprom co-op maybe forming. What do you think?
Well, I think to begin with, as preface, when I saw the Syria story, my suspicions went up, just like they did with Cyprus. One of the key players in Cyprus in the background was Gazprom Bank. Okay, when Syria erupted, I thought, well, gee, isn't that the port for some Iranian pipeline? So I guess maybe they want to interrupt that. I mean, that was my thought in the first 5 seconds. So there's pipeline politics. And, you know, take a closer look at some of the pipeline battles that the United States has grappled with, and you'll see that U.S. is losing on all of them. A year ago, there was a big battle on Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, and the U.S. tried to interrupt it, and, you know, it wasn't just, you know, bank interruptions. It was a lot of other strong-arm interruptions. If you help the Iranians, we will do this to you. I mean, this is how this gunboat diplomacy that you referred to as, you know, Tomahawk standard. I say the U.S. dollar has been defended by the military for the last 20 years. But I started looking closer at Syria and realized that Russia is the big beneficiary, because if the Iran pipeline, I call it the Shiite pipeline. I mean, I like to be funny. I like to be clever. But if you look at the parties that are involved in the Iran pipeline that would end up in Syria, it's the Shiite element of Iraq, and it's the Shiite element of Syria. And who would control it? It would be Gazprom and Russia. Where would the gas go from Syria port but Western Europe? Notice that England backed off in support militarily for the United States in actions against Syria. I think they got a phone call from the Kremlin and from the CEO of Gazprom saying, what the hell do you think you're doing? I mean, what are you going to heat your homes in England with? because we're going to cut off that 25 or 30% supply, overnight. Wake up. So the British backed off and the U.S. found itself isolated. One of my big forecasts for the last year or two has been that the U.S. is going to be isolated all across the board. Now, back to Saudi. Saudi is in control of OPEC, clearly. I mean, the OPEC leader is, I think his name is Nabal or something like that, but he speaks for OPEC. I think it's going to be phased out. OPEC is going to be phased out as being on the margin because the pipelines are mostly gas. They're organized by Gazprom, and even the Israelis have a contract for their Tamar floating platform in the Mediterranean to go into the Gazprom supply network. Even Israel will be supplying Western Europe. As Western Europe becomes more dependent on the Gazprom gas, they're going to start looking east and not west. They'll turn their back on the U.S. and they'll start not taking orders, but they'll start cooperating more with meetings and, summit meetings on commerce and rail delivery and, liquefied natural gas and commodity supply with Russia. They already do to a great extent with Russia. But I think the Nat Gas Co-op, which has got Qatar, Iran, Israel, and Russia, and Turkmenistan, a very big gas producer, Turkmenistan, old Soviet republic. These nations form the core of the Nat Gas Co-op. And what I say is it's going to form a ring of gas pipelines that serve as a noose around the petrodollar and render obsolete OPEC. And then comes the big problems for the U.S. economy and U.S. Treasury bonds as the petrodollar slides into obsolescence and a new chapter is born. And energy payments are not going to be made, oil or gas, largely in dollars. When that happens, Plain, it's just so simple in the logic. If the nations of the world are not going to pay for energy in U.S. dollars, the vehicle being treasury bonds or treasury bills, they're not going to need it for their banking systems. Their reserves management is going to diversify out of the treasury bonds. And what you're going to see is QE is not going to be $80 billion a month or $40 billion a month. I always like to double it because, I like to introduce reality. They're not going to just be $40 billion a month. It's going to be, 3, 4, 5 times that because the world's going to ask to redeem their toilet paper. I mean, the treasury bonds.
Jim?
Yes.
It's Gigi in Chicago. So I have a question for you. I've been reading your letters for years, and I totally appreciate what you're saying, that we're looking at really at an eyes wide shut phenomenon. The movie, I think, was spectacular. My question is really for those of us who are sitting back here with our families, the bridge of when this crashes, how prices are established for metals and bartering, and how we go about that. Does that make sense? In our everyday lives, we're looking at, I'm assuming, a hyperinflationary, depressionary experience coming?
Well, I think we've got a somewhat inflationary, mild inflationary depression right now. I mean, right. I laugh when I hear that we got 1.5%, 2% growth. Subtract 5. Subtract 5 from the GDP economic growth that we hear about from the U.S. government, because that's what they lie by on the CPI, and they're deflators. So we've got a depression now, and we've got some pretty chronic, strong inflation between, I don't know exactly, 6 and 10% year after year for probably 7 straight years. When the petrodollar problems erupt, when the petrodollar is phased out, we're going to go into a new level of crisis in the U.S. economy where we don't see 6 and 7% price inflation. We're going to see a sudden jump of 15 to 20%. I'm talking about prices not quite across the board, but on a
asset class. Asset class. Yep.
No, not so much. No, I'm just mean when you go to buy when you pay your monthly bills, it's your utilities, it's your food, it's your gasoline, your whole monthly costs are going to go up by about 15 or 20% suddenly. All of them. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say all of them. There's a lot of domestically produced goods. Agriculture, for example. The U.S. produces a tremendous amount of agriculture and used to supply half the world's food. That's not, well, California used to supply half the world's food. The United States supplies, I think, around 60% of the world's food. That's not going to double in price. It's going to go up in price because it also has some foreign dependence for its cost structure. Just think of, well, they're going to have to run diesel. They're going to on their tractors and the big farm machinery. They've got other expenses in dairy. They need cement and lumber and all kinds of different things, supplies. So, a good rule of thumb is that the U.S. economy has about a 50% foreign dependence. So if the dollar drops 30% on a devaluation, expect about half that to be the effect in price inflation suddenly. Now, I like to point to three areas that are important: gas stations, ATM machines, and supermarkets. I think the gas stations are going to be points of violence for the shortage. People are going to get tired of waiting in line, and when they're finally done with their 2.5 hours of wait, sorry, that gas pump is all empty now. You're going to have to go to another place, another 2 hours. So tempers are going to flare on a regular basis. Supermarkets are going to start having empty shelves. We already are seeing many shelves at Walmart empty. Not across the board, but some of their merchandise shelf. It's from a related reason, not exactly tied to the dollar, but tied with their cash management. They've got a very tight cash management system. So as their cash flow slows, they have an amplified effect on their reduction for inventory. And the third area is going to be ATM machines. I think banks are just going to say, sorry, we don't have any money. But wait a minute, I've got an account there. Yeah, well, you used to. I mean, yeah, you got on paper, you got an account, but doesn't mean that we have any money to give you toward your account. The petrodollar decline and demise is going to result in price inflation, supply shortage, and civil disorder with violence.
So, Jim, do you have a timeline here? Because it keeps getting pushed out. I mean, this has been going on since 2000, 2005, 2008. And now it's 2013, and we're hearing from everybody in the marketplace, look to 2014, 15 now for this to really come to a head.
Well, I think it's starting to come to a head right now. The events in Egypt and Syria could not be more significant. The U.S. puppet was thrown out. I'm surprised that he wasn't killed in Egypt. Right. And the U.S. did a fast retreat, and now its military is not respected worldwide because of Syria. So, I don't have a timetable. When I started this newsletter in 2004, I thought by 2010 that the dollar would be pretty much dead and buried, and we'd be on some kind of a gold standard or something quasi-gold standard. Right. But, I got to give these bankers, these Nazis, I don't like calling them too big to fail banks. I like to call them Nazi banks. Because if you look back into the 40s, you'll see that they gave significant loans to Nazi Germany. If you look back and examine some of the behavior of the Swiss central banks and the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, you'll see that there was a lot of cooperation among, like, even Bank of England with some of the Nazis as they were pillaging the Czech central bank and taking everything. So these guys are Nazis. Bush's father, for instance, not Papa Bush, but Prescott Bush, he's responsible for an attempted coup d'etat of the Nazis over Franklin Roosevelt. And, we need to wake up to who these people are in the U.S. New York banks.
Couldn't agree more.
Pardon me?
Hey, Jim, I have a question for you. Would you say that perhaps the only way we're going to get out of this is to hyperinflate away the debt?
No, we're not going to get out of this. We're not going to be able to hyperinflate the debt out because the debt's going to be rejected. It's going to be defaulted, and the dollar's going to be rejected. That's what I meant to say. I got word 2 weeks ago, a very surprising message from The Voice, who has some significant Chinese and Hong Kong clients. I'm talking about multi-billionaires. I'm talking about agents who work for the People's Bank of China. I'm talking about really big billionaires in Hong Kong who like to collect gold. He said, Jim, the Chinese have already made plans for writing off $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. And I wrote back and said, well, gee, if your other call of a significant dollar devaluation takes place, I can't imagine that the euro, yen, and Swiss franc and British pound will all go up because they're lashed together. So I'm thinking that if the dollar gets devaluated, it'd be devaluated against the ultimate currency, that is gold. And he sort of gave a tacit agreement, but he's coy at times. And when he's involved with specifically, directly in things, he likes to be a little bit more quiet. He'll throw something out and let me comment on it. And if he doesn't contradict it, it's probably true. And he'd just rather not talk more about it because he's involved. But the dollar is going to be devaluated. It's going to have a very hard fall. The world is going to have to adapt to something different. There's going to be a race, a big contest race to dump the Treasury bonds. The U.S. is not going to get the privilege of the past. All these past cycles, throw them out. None of them. No past is prologue for what's coming because this is a paradigm shift. The U.S. is not going to have a chance to inflate its debt away and say, well, you know, we're going to have to deal with 10% inflation a year for the next 5 years. We don't have any significant growth. We don't even have an economic recovery. We don't have a housing recovery. We have insolvent banks that are toppling right now from interest rate derivatives. JP Morgan just sold its entire tower and plaza property to a Chinese property conglomerate. I think they got a margin call. Now the Chinese own the biggest gold vault in the world, located underground at the JP Morgan Plaza called One Chase Plaza. We're not going to get a chance to inflate our way out. We're going to default. And then we're not going to have an opportunity to cover our debt because no one will lend money to a defaulted nation unless, of course, they got a bunch of Tomahawk cruise missiles pointing at them. And the Russians are going to step in and say, we will neutralize that.
I guess I'm just trying to make a comparison to the Weimar Republic, where they were under crushing war reparations, and they basically just ran the printing presses nonstop and hyperinflated everything away. I guess I don't understand why the United States couldn't do that. It would seem to me that that would be, you know, a couple of years of extreme pain followed by some type of recovery.
Well, Plain, you used the word would. I don't know why the U.S. wouldn't do that. They are doing that. So your future concept is happening in the present right now. QE is what you're talking about. QE started in, I think, early 2012 or late 2011. That is inflating the debt away. They are monetizing the debt. That is what you're talking about. So, you know, you got to step back 3 years, 2 years on your perceptions there. We're not going to be able to continue with an acceleration of the current policy of inflating our debt away. We're not inflating the debt away. We're just inflating the coverage of the debt because nobody wants to buy treasury bonds except nations like, oh gosh, it's kind of funny. Russia is buying some because they want to prevent their currency from damaging their economy too much. Now, we've already got the phase where the U.S. is inflating toward their debt, but it's not going away. It's getting worse. And war is the reason why it's getting worse. Nobody talks about war and why the deficits are so big. Half of the U.S. $17 trillion is from war.
Jim, got a question for you. So the big topic here is the development of essentially Central Asia from Turkey to China and all that, and the new Silk Road and all of these pipelines and fast trains and expressways and all that, right? And so this is a tremendous deal. But at the same time, we see conflicting forces. I mean, I think today or yesterday, there was talk of India and Pakistan being invited into the SCO. But at the same time, we see all these questionable terrorist-type events in these countries, right? And one has to wonder if that isn't the American response. Do you have any thoughts on how America is likely to respond to this development of the new Silk Road and Central Asia and all that?
Well, I'm sure that Al-Qaeda will show up and bomb.
They already did. Isn't that what's going on in Dagestan and in Peking and everywhere else?
And Oslo, Norway.
Yeah, so, don't they show up in very selective places, don't they?
Well, they show up wherever the Americans need help in changing others' foreign policy. Now, the headquarters of Al-Qaeda is Langley, Virginia. All right, I'd like to make a comment. You talk about linking, a trade zone from Turkey to China. I think it's bigger than that. It's from England and Western Europe through Turkey to China. It's the Eurasian trade zone. It's all of Europe plus Asia, the Eurasian trade zone. What you referred to was an Asian trade zone. This is going to be Eurasian. And to give you an idea of some of the backbone for it, there are numerous rail lines. They're called heavy rail because they don't carry passengers. They carry loaded cars with coal, loaded cars with cement, gravel, whatever, copper bars. There are many, many rail lines that start somewhere in Russia and end up in Germany. Well, gee, there's your hint that Germany sees its future on the east side, the eastern hemisphere of the world, not so much with the United States anymore. The ties with the United States have been financial and economic. Lately, they've been more financial and less economic because the emerging market nations they're just making their presence known with manufacturing plants and accumulating reserves and wealth and these emerging market nations, they don't want to throw their money and their surplus into treasury bonds and have it devaluated. So they're pursuing something very different along with Russia and China. It's the G20, the SCO, you talk about the Shanghai Co-op Organization. I don't play because they're the ones making big decisions. They're the ones making the plans for gold trade settlement. They're the ones that are inviting Iran to participate with the energy flow. They're the ones who are inviting Turkey to supply gold as intermediary to counterparties who wish to have, on a net basis, gold trade settlement. So a lot is going on with the Eurasian trade zone, and the U.S. is at a very high acute risk of not participating in the biggest trade zone in the world.
Okay, a key question then that some people are asking that you hear, and that is, are the powers that be in the U.S. really trying to retrench, kind of consolidate their power back in the U.S.? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have too many thoughts. I think they're in a state of desperation.
Well, they got a lot of money invested around the world. They can sell shares. They can. They've got a lot of technology hidden away in the black budgets in the military. They're 20, 30 years ahead of what we get to see. So
well, I realize that. They've also got a good deal of people on the ground disrupting foreign economies. Their foreign policy pretty much is now involved in securing supply. And war is a big part of that. War supplied the U.S. with Iraqi oil. And, Americans don't know anything about what's going on with U.S. military policy and agency policy, the security agency policy. But Iraq, because of the war in Iraq, we forced the abrogation of Iraqi Russian contracts and Iraqi Chinese contracts. And we took all of the oil supply. All right, so there's a motive with Iraq with oil. It's pretty plain. We've got a lot of other policy. We do various things in Egypt. We do things in Pakistan. We've got a foreign policy in Pakistan run by drones with men sitting in San Diego and Tampa, Florida, who are killing civilians. That's part of our foreign policy now. It's wonderful. It's just wonderful. It's spreading democracy. 2 years ago, you take a closer look at some of the foreign policy. We didn't like how Norway refused to help the British banks when they were in their time of need. The Norwegians own a, I don't know, $800 billion pension fund. It's largely a North Sea oil surplus fund. And they didn't want to pitch it into London. Next thing you know, we had an Al-Qaeda event in Oslo with, once again, a lone crazy gunman. How many lone gunmen do you need to see before you conclude they're not alone?
It's not possible. You're correct.
Well, they're spaced by time, Gigi. That's the funny part. You talk to intelligent American folks and they say, yeah, but that was 8 months ago. Well, yeah, it's the same coordinating team. You could make an argument that John Lennon is part of the victim list. You can make a long, long list. I was 11 years old, 12 years old, 11 years old when Kennedy was shot. And I thought, lone gunman? I don't think so. I'm only 11. I don't think so, Daddy. That doesn't make any sense. And then they killed Ruby. I'm sorry, Ruby killed Oswald. And I thought, oh, okay, that's like a bad movie, Daddy. The guy
he was a double.
Killed. So the lone gunmen are getting killed. You know, you take a close look at the grassy knoll in 63 in Dallas, and you got about 30 mysterious deaths of witnesses who were on the grassy knoll in Dallas in November of 1963. Now you got mysterious deaths of witnesses at the World Trade Center from September of 2001. These people are good. They're killers.
Jim, some people might argue that the people at the top of the pyramid don't give a crap about the West anyhow, when they're actually imploding it by design, whereas maybe, say, some people lower down the tier want to hold on to the reins for a bit longer. What do you think about that theory?
I think it makes total sense. I learned about 3 years ago that in order to put on I don't like, NWO. I don't like getting specific like that. I just call it a global fascist state. In order to impose the global fascist state, you need to knock off the bastion, the leader of freedom. You need to knock off the bastion, the cradle of capitalism.
Russia?
No, it's the United States.
Just kidding. Sorry, I was joking.
Yeah, I know. Back in 1985, the U.S. had a lot of respect globally. As a friend of mine said, you could put a British flag on the back of a camel crossing a Saudi Arabian, pathway, and nobody would touch it. Now they urinate on it. So times have changed. I think I call them the castle dwellers. I try not to mention their names, but David Rockefeller is one of them. David Rockefeller is a 95-year-old, 94-year-old Satanist, and they have their plans. And I think their main plan, starting around 1990, was to wreck the United States. And Bill Clinton had a nice part in that. He hired Robert Rubin, and they, together with the help of Papa Bush and the CIA, they helped to raid and gut Fort Knox. If you want to kill the U.S., first thing you need to do is the standard MO for Nazis: steal the gold from their central bank. How many examples did we see in World War II of stolen central bank gold? Yet nobody seems to understand it's the same bloodline that stole Fort Knox. So they stole Fort Knox, got rid of the basis for the dollar, and then, gosh, let's outsource industry. The Bush administration, followed by the Clinton administration, never got in the way of outsourcing industry. Why did Germany do the opposite? The Germans did something different. They said, we're going to take our labor unions, bring them all together, have a national forum here, and really hack it out. And what they agreed on was a 15% wage decline with some benefits reduced, and they did not shed their industry. And they keep getting They keep accumulating a trade surplus. The United States did the opposite. We got the corporate band together who talk with the White House, the Clinton-Rubin gang, Clinton-Rubin-Bush gang. These guys are working together. I don't care what political party they are. It's the bankers versus the non-bankers, the people versus the bankers. It's the old argument. Eventually, the people were going to oppose the bankers, but we started. But they're outsourcing industry, and your listeners need to understand what was the motive for giving China the most favored trade status. Why were they given most favored nation status in 1999? I struggled with that for about 5 or 6 years. I had a hard time just accepting, low-cost solution. When I looked at the low-cost solution, my immediate second thought was, yeah, but where's the legitimate income going to come from in the United States economy? And I heard, you've got the rising assets from the stock market and the housing industry. And I said, well, that's bubble dependence. That goes away in 4 or 5 years. So I concluded that around 2007, 2008, when the housing market declined, the banks would be ruined, and the U.S. would enter a depression and not get out of it, even with 0%. And so far, that's turned out to be correct. But let me answer my own question. Why were the Chinese given by the U.S. government leadership? Why were the Chinese given most favored nation status with a promise of tens of billions of dollars in foreign direct investment to build manufacturing plants and industries all across China to capture it and exploit its cheaper labor? Why? Because China lent Wall Street a lot of gold to keep this thing going even more. They bought a few more years of time, promised the Chinese that in 05 or 06 that they would give back the leased gold. Instead, they said F you to the Chinese, and the cooperative agreement that we had with China turned into a trade war around 2006 or 7. Precisely when the gold was due. They call it Mao Zedong era gold. And there was some silver in there too. So the U.S. made itself an enemy, and I think that something much, much bigger is going on than just the U.S. being clamped down and smothered. I mean, if you look at the Fed policy, and this is not recognized by even 3% or 5% of economists. QE, the bond monetization, kills capital. So when they say they're going to keep the bond monetization going and the lax monetary policy going until there's a U.S. economic recovery, what they're saying instead is we're going to keep the QE monetary policy where we're monetizing bonds until the default of government debt from economic collapse takes place, because it's killing capital. And how is it killing capital? I mean, this is so basic to economists, but they're basic harlots working for Wall Street banks and the government. Is
it possible, Jim, that is it possible, Jim, that the Fed could need a bailout? Is that at all a possibility? Would that even be part of the process?
No, nothing's going to bail it out. They're bailing it out now, and it's not working. Both you guys seem to be saying or hoping that something's going to come to the rescue of the United States. And
I'm just curious if that's part of what's in the unwinding of the QE that's coming up.
No,
You're saying it's not going to happen.
The Fed is that rescue team now, and it's failing.
Right.
So the Fed is an agent to destroy the United States, not to wreck it, not to rescue it. QE wrecks capital. It kills capital because the natural response to such rampant inflation is to hedge against it with hard assets, which means the cost structure goes up, profit margins decrease, and capital is turned off, retired, liquidated, sold, and killed. The
Jim,
Fed is not rescuing anything.
This leads to, and it begs the question about your discussion of a gold standard. I mean, is it possible that these people behind the Fed have tremendous sums of gold in vaults in Switzerland or whatever, and they're expecting a currency collapse, and they'll be there waiting for the new one?
I think that's part of it, but anyone who believes that the same I call them Anglo bankers. That includes New York. New York and London bankers, I call the Anglo bankers. People who assume that the Anglos are going to be in charge of the next chapter, I think, are fools.
No, I didn't say that. I'm in
I know.
Asia, and I don't take that. I don't take that view, but I'm just saying, from their narrow perspective, they don't care about the citizens in the U.S., right? So that's not the issue. The issue is how long can they maintain the game, and they know it's a limited lifespan, right? So, but they do have whatever the amounts are. You talked about the Nazi bankers earlier and how they plunder gold, like maybe Libya's gold, right?
Exactly.
Well, those are the guys we're talking about, right?
Yeah, but I think they want to retire. I think that they've got their resorts in Switzerland. They've got their locations in Haifa, Israel. They've got their getaway in Paraguay. I heard 6 months ago that the number of airlifts going from the United States to Paraguay increased tenfold in the last year. They're already making their getaway. I think what they're doing is they got a sandbag plan for the United States to destroy the capitalism, to destroy its liberties. So there's no more beacon of freedom. There's no more cradle of capitalism. And then this global fascist state can attempt to take over, where these Anglo elites are going to be retired with their children, and they're going to have their big bank accounts in gold. Now, Jim Sinclair pointed out at a Toronto conference, it was March in 2009. I know that because I had a friend who was there. And he came back and said, Sinclair just made an announcement. He was nervous when he said it, and he let it be known that he was uneasy talking about it. And he had delayed in discussing it. But the counterparties for all the big four banks in the United States, and add Barclays in London, so these big Anglo banks are short gold. Well, who's got the long counterparty position? A lot of them are private accounts from Wall Street and London banker executives. They're not the bank's positions. They're the executives' private offshore bank positions. And then there's another side, and it's the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which gets no press at all. That's a big, big intervention fund managed by the Department of Treasury. And they've got a lot of the pro-gold, long gold counterparty position. And a lot of counterparty position for many other different things, like the German stock market or French stock market or Financial Times British stock market. But this is very complicated. I don't think that the Anglo leaders in the banking elite are planning to take control the next chapter. I think they're going to pass the baton to Russia and China and ask that they can be not killed in return.
Good point. That whole scenario was just terrific, because I've wondered about who the longs were in the market as well. Thank you.
Well, I don't have all the answers. I try to piece things together, but it's extremely difficult. And what I've heard was that there are a number of different Asian organizations that are pursuing the Anglo bankers right now. And they've got a list of 500 that they want to kill or disappear. So, the Anglo bankers might have a hard time struggling in Switzerland, Israel, and Paraguay.
Hey, Jim.
They might not be left alone. I don't think they're going to be allowed to live on the Cayman Island. They're not going to be left alone. There are too many people who hate them. And this is getting so weird that the criminal organizations like the mafias, the Japanese Yakuza has been hired for a long time to do Western dirty work. The M organization out of Israel, they've been doing dirty work for decades. But there's another organization, it's called the Triad. They're out of Hong Kong. They're deadly. And they've been even invited to come here to Costa Rica to maintain the peace between the Mexican drug lords and the Colombian drug lords, to protect the Chinese interests here. So,
is that the White Dragon Society? Or is that different?
Well, the White Dragons have been hiring the Triad. The Triad is not the White Dragons. The Triad is a crime organization that's been around for 40 years or more. Maybe 300 years.
I would say sure. 4,000, if that's just
You might be right. I'm showing my ignorance here, but they've been prominent in the global games far more than just a regional basis for over 40 years. And I'm hearing that they're being hired more and more by significant groups who want to get things done. And when I heard 3 months ago that they were hired to come in to keep the peace between the two big factions fighting over Costa Rica. By the way, Costa Rica is a huge trafficking center from South America to North America. Trafficking, and I mean, I hate to say, but I've heard stories of trafficking in women. I know of a fellow who has, on 3 different occasions, been accosted by the sister of a missing woman who went out on a Chinese yacht off the coast for a week of fun and frolic, drinking and sex and whatever, for a nice big payday like $1,000, except they never came back. So there is some trafficking going on. It's not just money and drugs, but the women is that's a much smaller piece of what Costa Rica is all about. Costa Rica is very big into drugs and money.
Hey, Jim, we got one.
Go ahead, Blaine.
Okay, I'll give you mine. Some people theorize that essentially after World War II, and we saw it with the first Bilderberg meeting, there was kind of a coming together of what you might call the Anglo bankers and the, shall we say, Teutonic technologists or Teutonic faction. And that maybe there's kind of a divorce between the banker faction and those who, let's say, control the military black budget, so to speak. You know, the stuff in space and you know, the stuff at the bottom of the ocean and all that other stuff. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but superficially, there's a bit that could make sense out of that. The weapons are getting so good that maybe those in charge of the weapons just feel like they don't need the bankers anymore.
We're always going to need the bankers, even if it's to just guard the gold vaults.
Yeah, but I mean in terms of they don't have to listen to them as equals. They can just say, you go to Paraguay and be thankful we let you stay down there.
Well, yeah, but the old adage of whoever controls the gold controls the power, I think that is very true. And now we're starting to see that there's some ancient Chinese families that are coming forward with a tremendous amount of gold, and some of the stories are very real. Okay, when I got really close and had, I don't know, 3 or 4 long conversations per week with The Voice, this is back in 2009, late 2008 and 2009, because this is when he gave me a month pre-warning. I got a tip-off a month in advance of Lehman falling. He actually asked me, Jim, there are 3 companies that they're gonna die. Can you guess what they are? And I said, "Were you talking about out of New York?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, Lehman Brothers." This is back in July and August of 2008. I said, "Well, Lehman Brothers credit default swap is really going up fast. I think that Lehman's going to die and it's going to be a victim of the mortgage bonds." He said, "Okay, you got one." And I said, "Well, the Fannie Mae stock is down 90%. I've been talking about the housing market, going to hell, and I think a big victim is going to be Fannie Mae. So I think Fannie Mae is probably going to be a second dead element." And he said, "Yeah, you got 2. And I said, "I don't know the third." And he said, "Well, it's insurance." And I said, "Oh, I don't know, Nationwide. It's not on my side." We joked around. He said, "No, that's not it. I'm not going to tell you what it is." What turned out to be AIG. In the subsequent conversations, after everything fell apart, we talked a lot about how the U.S. government debt was going to face enormous pressures toward default. And I said, well, they're going to move it right down to 0%. I said this back in January and February of 2009, long before the ZIRP policy, the 0% interest rate policy came into effect. I said, they're going to move it down to 0%, but it's not going to work. It's not going to stimulate anything because we gave up our industry, which is the traction. for any new CapEx, new capital expenditure, business investment. We gave up our traction to the Chinese for industry. And then we started talking about, I'm getting to your answer here. We started talking about, groups like the Bilderbergers. And he said, Jim, Bilderbergers get a lot of attention. And can you tell me why they do get a lot of attention now suddenly? And here we are in 2009. And I said, well, my guess is the Bilderbergers get a lot of attention because they're not in power anymore. And he said, excellent point, Jim. You got it. They're in the news because they can't stop from being in the news anymore since they don't have the power anymore. And their meetings, like in Vancouver, are being crashed by moles who seek information. And I said, well, okay, if the Bilderbergers are not the powerful entity, who is? And he said a number of important groups. A year later, he outlined them. He said there are three important groups among the bankers. You could call them bankers, but they're really more like super elite. And I said, the castle dweller. He said, yeah, you can call them castle dweller. That's fine. The super elite come from three groups. I try to avoid the J word. I'm not talking about Jerusalem, but it's related. But there's a type of banker from a certain ethnic group, and they have dietary desires that avoid pork. Okay, that is one group. There's a second group of bankers that are the Satanists. And I don't use this word lightly. I'm talking about Satanists who have ceremonies. And the Bushes are in this group. I'm talking about satanic ceremonies and child sacrifices. Take a close look at Sandy Hook. And I will not say one more word about Sandy Hook. The third group of sick bankers in the super elite is the narco barons. And that includes Bush, whose personal wealth, along with his son, is something on the order of $3 to $4 trillion. He's not on the Forbes list because he's told Forbes, don't put me on the list. No one wants to have, none of these guys want to have questions of Bush when he's going to the supermarket or whatever. Gee, I heard you have $3 trillion. Where'd you get all that money? Well, the answer is $1.03 from Afghan heroin goes to the Bush family. All right, back to the three groups. So you got the non-pork bankers, you got the satanic bankers, and you got the narco bankers. There's a conflict among all three. They don't like each other. They don't get along. The two satanic and the non-pork bankers, they get along better, but they hate the narcos because they think that they're Johnny-come-latelys. I love that phrase. These narco barons became trillionaires too quickly. It didn't take them 100 years. It didn't take Bush 100 years. It took only 1973 with Air America, the other motive for the Vietnam War, the Cambodian Triangle. Did you know, listeners, that there were more tonnage of bombs dropped in Laos and Cambodia outside Vietnam than in Vietnam during the war? And the U.S. military likes to say, well, that's where the supply routes are coming from. No, that was for the battle for control of the Cambodian heroin triangle. Why did the U.S. delay its entry into the Yugoslavian conflict after Tito died? Clinton announced in 93 or 4, we're not going to get involved in a domestic dispute. Then later we did, because we captured the Eastern European heroin market and made sure that the Chechens did not get it all. Now you've got Afghanistan. So the three pieces are there: Cambodian Triangle, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. U.S. controls 90% of the world's heroin.
What about the chivalric orders? Do you put them in there? The black nobility crowd from Venice and Knights of Malta, Knights Templar, Teutonic Knights?
They're all in the mix, and I just don't know how it all ties together, but there's some strange things going on right now. I've been told that the Asians are giving orders to the Vatican. The Asians ordered that Benedict retire early. The Asians dictated that the fascists, you can look at the Vatican. and people who I talk to, I say, are you aware that the Vatican has a lot of bankers? Oh, you mean in addition to the cardinals, do they work for the cardinal? No, the cardinals work for the bankers. And take a close look at the cause of death for John Paul II, in office for 30 days. He was murdered.
33 days, wasn't it?
Okay, he was murdered.
So why this sudden cleanup at the Vatican Bank, Jim?
I don't really know, but I think there's some, I call it the new sheriff in town, and I think it's the White Dragons. I'm not really sure. It's very difficult to get confirmation, but I was told a year and a half ago, no, I was told around 2 years ago, November of 11. I remember because I have a different apartment every year, it seems. I remember where I was sitting, and I got a message saying that a powerful Eastern force has just made available $50 billion, and they're going to start pursuing gold. And clowns who watch things like the White Dragon stories say, well, gee, they've got all that gold, the price of gold's going to go under 1,000. Well, that's a bunch of BS. But they use the gold as collateral to raise cash. And with the cash, they went and pursued London gold, and they've drained at least 5,000 tons out of London banks of gold. That's to rescue control of gold, to send it east. And it has not stopped. I've got, very specific word that from April 1st to July 1st, they had 5,000 metric tons shipped out of London, gone eastward, mostly to Hong Kong and Beijing. And I just got word 2 weeks ago that it never stopped. I ask questions. I have every single month almost. I said, has the shipment of gold from London stopped? Did it end in July? I got no answer. And finally, I got about 3 weeks ago, I got an answer. I go, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Things are really heating up. So a new sheriff is in town, and you have to look at a lot of details regarding the London purchases. If they had margin calls, why didn't they just print money and pay off the margin call? It was because the London bankers used Chinese gold improperly as margin for European sovereign bond derivatives and futures contracts that all went bad. They all went bad and they got wrecked. So the Chinese stepped forward and said, all right, we're going to enforce the margin call. And they had to replace more margin in like kind. So they had to come up with more gold to get rid of the margin call and satisfy the Chinese, who were going to come forward on a threat to demonstrate to the world in evidence that the London bankers improperly used allocated gold. And, it's not just going to be the gold trade standard coming into place. It's going to be the replacement of stolen and misused allocated gold accounts from private elites. And, just take a look at Central Europe. It's mostly Switzerland, but there's been a lot of pilfered gold in Swiss private bullion banks. Just think of, Mr. and Mrs. Dusseldorf, and they've got $150 million, and $100 million is sitting in gold bullion. Well, sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Dusseldorf, you don't have that gold anymore because your criminal bankers that you had been trusting for 70 years in your family sold your gold and replaced them with paper certificates. They're going to have to replace that. And we're not talking about a few tons. We're talking about at least 20,000 tons of improperly used allocated gold, maybe over 40,000 tons of improperly used gold. And some of this improperly used gold was in London. And that's part of the 5,000 tons that has continued. We're talking about something on the order of 1,000 tons a month or more. That's a lot of gold. And if it continued for another year, we're talking about another 18,000 or 12,000 more tons. So maybe we've had as much as 18,000 tons, 17,000 tons leave London and Switzerland heading to points east since April of 2012. That's enough to change the balance of power and the privilege for giving Vatican new orders. Let me just explain something quickly about the Vatican. Vatican has slush fund private accounts. Obama has a multi-million-dollar private account in the Vatican. And so does Geithner, and so does Paulson, and so does Clinton, so does Hillary. And they're trying to clean it up. on orders from the new sheriff in town. And I wish I knew what some of their leverage was. I think it was simple. We'll hire the triad to murder you and your family. That's what I think is their leverage. But I can't prove anything. I'm just guessing. Maybe their leverage is a sudden sale of treasury bonds. Do we really know who ordered the Fed to do their stupid taper talk plan in May? Do we really know who gave the order? Was it China?
Was it a test?
I don't think the Fed did a test because they knew what the answer would be. Full dependence of the treasury bond market, full dependence of financial markets in the Western world. This is basic. I've been saying for 3 years they can't stop the big aid for 2 years since QE began. They can't stop the big aid and support for the treasury bond monetization because if they do, things will fall apart. It's obvious. Full dependence.
Okay, Oolong, go ahead.
Yeah, I've just got a question. How long, like with all this gold flowing to the east, Jim, how long can they keep suppressing the price? And the second part of that question is, do you think that the Easterners want a lower price and they're participating in it?
I don't have a time answer when you say when or how long. The answer is not according to a calendar. The answer is according to events. You know, I first got exposed to the concept of an event-based sequence when it came to the Iraq invasion by the United States. By the way, the U.S. stole their central bank gold. We stole the Baghdad gold.
I'm shocked.
Stole all of it. Okay, I got exposed to the event schedule from that war, and then I've come to learn that you can't say, well, you know, by the time we get through the December contract, the COMEX is going to be dead. No, you can't talk that way. You have to think in terms of the COMEX will continue to suppress the price of gold until they don't have any. So what's the pace of the decline of the COMEX gold? Take a look at the chart and you can see that they're on pace for being out of gold in January. Is that why JP Morgan sold to the Chinese their vault and their whole office complex? Are they getting out of town? Okay, you could say, well, gee, you know, we've already gotten a formal statement that GATA reported on, a formal statement that COMEX let it be known that their data is not reliable. So do we even know how much COMEX gold is in their inventory? And, you know, I don't distinguish between the JP Morgan inventory and the COMEX inventory because JP Morgan is the operating arm of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So I don't know when they're going to run out of gold. I do know that they're raiding the hell out of the GLD, the SPDR Gold Trust, recasting its gold and sending it to Hong Kong. There's some story that it's coming back west, but that's a bunch of BS. It might be going from China back west to India and no further to supply its jewelry market. You know, I think, you know, if I had to be pinned down, what month are we going to say the COMEX is not suppressing price anymore? My answer is simple. I don't know. I don't have a month. I have to look at when are they going to be out of gold? And it looks like they don't have very many more months left. And it looks like the GLD fund is rapidly declining. It's under 1,000 tons right now. I think it was as high as 1,400 or 1,500 tons several months ago. So it's on pace for running out. But I think the GLD gold is going to satisfy Chinese interests, and the JP Morgan gold is going to satisfy the contracts. But take a look at just May, June, July, and August. JP Morgan is making sure that none of the contracts for gold are even being delivered upon. So we're already approaching a crisis point in the COMEX where they might not have much of any gold left, and they're not really delivering on much of any contract. I don't say all. I don't know. I think it's the majority. But gosh, it can't continue much longer. And I don't have much sympathy for people who say, well, gee, I'm getting tired of this. So am I. I don't have sympathy for it because you have to look at the events, and the events are very clear. The events that are happening now are completely different from a year ago. We're making progress toward shutting down the COMEX and killing off the big New York banks. Because,
hey, Jim,
yeah.
Rome wasn't collapsed in a day,
Yeah, I know. And Caligula.
It takes a while. And now you're depressing me because, here I was thinking of maybe moving to Uruguay, and you're telling me that all these J.P. Morgan types might be in Paraguay right next door. So that's kind of a bummer.
No, but there's the border between those countries, and there's a big jungle in between. Don't worry.
I know. There's a little safety there. I know. Okay, but I do have one big question, though.
Well, let me get back to your second half of the question. I think China is cooperating in keeping the price down because they like a lower price. I think China is shorting the market along with New York banks, and they got some brotherhood of thieves involved.
Okay, but here's the follow-up to that, and that is, what are your thoughts on the whole Yamashita's gold, the stolen resources of World War II that the Japanese had, and a lot of it was in the Philippines and Marcos and so on and so forth? How much of that is in play, and just anyway, your thoughts on that?
That's a huge question. It's very difficult to nail down. I'm trying to open up a file. I'm going to search on the word.
M-Fund is all of the corruption in Japan after World War II has the stolen loot as being a key element in it.
Yeah, well, this has got many different sides. I actually have 3 different sources that have nothing to do with each other, all independent of each other, who confirm that the White Dragons have $100 trillion in gold bars. It's roughly, I don't have exact figures. It's 10 to 20 times what Fort Knox held. It's an enormous supply of gold. Apparently, some people were murdered in order to reveal where in the Philippines it was located. A lot of people were murdered when it was hidden, so that when the big hillside vaults were created, all the people who built it were murdered. The Yakuza had a hand in some of that. I don't have a lot of firm answers, but I've been amazed that 3 different people have told me that it's real, and it was dug up in the Philippines, and it came from centuries upon centuries of Chinese wealthy family accumulation. It was lost largely from the pillaging and the genocide rampaging of the Japanese in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. They made a regular habit of going into China for rampaging, killing off thousands, hundreds of thousands, and stealing gold. I mean, the Japanese are like, the best friends in MO to the Nazis. I don't have a lot of information on the Yamashita. I call it Yamashita. I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly, but I don't care about stuff like that. They did make it available, and it did work to change the geopolitical balance of power. And what I've come to learn is that a good deal of the London gold has been pursued and drained as a result of this White Dragon gold stash. It's a gigantic stash that would cover an entire football field full of wooden pallets stacked chest high. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of gold. They're not going to dump it on the market. They're going to use it to kill off the Anglo banker power structure. And that, I think, is their primary objective. And it surprised me several months ago when I heard that they hired the Triad to do their enforcement. Because let's face it, you need a countervailing force for the CIA and their murder squads, and you need a countervailing force for the same group that starts with an M in Israel. So now you got a 3-way structure where the U.S. and Israel are pretty much team players. Let me just give you a quick story that it points out how strange some of these things are. There were stories about how Mrs. Olson was on the commercial craft that hit the Pentagon. Well, I've got a source who was actually inside the Pentagon in September of '01, and he said that it was more like 100 pounds of CMEX planted in the Army Accounting Office because they didn't want the report to go out for $2 trillion in stolen appropriations. Anyway, supposedly Mrs. Olson was on the commercial aircraft that hit the Pentagon. She was given orders. You live in Sweden, you shut your mouth, and you stay inside the Swedish borders. It's called rules of engagement. Well, she was caught at the French-Swiss border in '09, carrying as a mule some bearer bonds, and she was escorted. Some people think that she was given protection in Paris. No, she was handed over to the M boys out of the Israeli group, where she was shot in the head because she violated the rules of engagement. She did not stay in Switzerland. She got bored after 8 years. Poor lady. Well, now she can sleep in a frickin' coffin. These guys operate with very serious rules of engagement. And I don't know what rules are going to be applied to these Anglo bankers, but I'm starting to hear from more than one source, undersea Caribbean prisons. So that was my third source to confirm the White Dragon enormous cache of gold. He actually told me in June, I told through a friend, he told through a friend that in June of 2012 that they had 450 mid-level bankers in the Caribbean undersea prison. And I said, why mid-level? Because they're not high enough ranked to be protected as directors and VPs, and they're not low enough ranked because they know what was going on. He said, yeah, they're not low enough. Low people don't know where money is moved and offshore accounts are located and scummy operations take place. Well, I got an update in June of 2013. Same guy, same contact friend. It was now close to 1,000 bankers, mid-level bankers in undersea Caribbean prisons. So, you know, I have a joke. I like to say, well, let them start their own currency system in this undersea prison and let it be their own teeth. They like extracting teeth.
They like teeth. Yes, that's a fair point.
Well, maybe they can get some gold fillings out of them too.
Well, may I ask a question though? Who would be managing these undersea prisons? Why not just shoot them? What's the point here?
Because they're flipping.
So you mean it's to protect them to get the stories out, the information out?
They're flipping and earning their way out. And they're apparently providing some rather ripe information. I can't get that out of the White Dragon contact. It's a fellow who comes to Costa Rica and does various things. He gave $5 billion to the Costa Rican Central Bank to prevent an insolvency grand problem for the nation and their banking system. He's doing a number of different things. He's trying to buy hundreds and hundreds of acres, thousands of acres for Chinese wealthy. They want to buy up the farmland. Where do you think the farm supply will be redirected afterwards? Higher prices in Costa Rica for food. That's what I foresee. No, it's really hard to get firm information, but I'm going to try to meet this fellow.
So, Jim,
well, it just sounds pretty far out. I mean, I'm not denying it. It's just kind of like, who has the juice to grab these people and haul them away?
Well, maybe it's done by the Triad plane. Maybe the
Have
Triad
they got the juice in London or New York to do that?
Well, who has the technology to travel in a craft undersea? A lot of people.
A lot of people do.
Who has the ability to build underground cities in the United States?
Well, lots of companies and countries have that.
Okay, then you can answer your own question then of whether such a thing is possible. I've seen pictures of undersea structures. I'll email you some.
Well, we've interviewed Richard Sauter, if you know who he is. He's the leading authority on underground bases and undersea bases. And, I mean, the technology was very good 40 years ago, so it's a safe bet. They've got incredible stuff today.
Well, there's a big undersea base off the U.S. naval installations in San Diego, a very big undersea facility. So maybe it was built by the U.S. military in the Caribbean. Maybe it's for docking with submarines. Maybe it was sold by the military to the Chinese 10 years ago. I don't know. I'm just raising questions.
Yeah, that's totally fair. It's just we're getting into a very, I don't know if you say far out subject, but the whole Yamashita's gold, that whole underground financial world that seems to be 10 times bigger than the one we can see.
Well, let me just raise a question to you. Do you think that September 2011 supposed earthquake in Virginia was really an earthquake? Bullshit. Excuse me.
No, I'm not a coincidence theorist, so I tend to look at these things with a jaded eye. That's very surprising, and to see, what was it, the Washington Monument cracking and all that?
Well, my source tells me that it was a sabotage of an underground city in Virginia. Tens of thousands perished. These are the type. Tens of thousands perished. These are not the types that live next door to you and have a wife and family and a little dog and a white picket fence. These are spooks who, if they die, you'll never know, and they don't have neighbors who will ask questions.
Hey, Jim, do you want a little quiz?
Sure.
Okay. In, I don't know, maybe 2006 or so, something like that, 2007, there were the largest electricity generating nuclear plant on Earth was in Niigata, Japan. 2 days in a row, big earthquakes hit. One was almost directly under it. Wiped it out of production, billions of dollars in damages. And there's been almost no discussion of this ever since.
Yeah, I know.
Can't prove anything. Don't even know if it leaked. I assume it did, but we don't. But the point is, that was an incredible economic hit on Japan, and there's almost no discussion of it.
Well, fast forward to February 2011 and take a look at a lot of the geological data that the Russian and Chinese scientists have gathered. And nearby Fukushima, there was a nuclear event. I'm not talking about a nuclear plant. I'm talking about a nuclear detonation event, followed hours later by an earthquake event. Two separate events with completely different scientific signatures. A nuclear event has a big boom on the meter scale, followed by a lot of little ones.
The P wave and then the S wave, yeah.
I'm not familiar with a lot of the details. I just know that it starts out huge and tapers down. The earthquake is the opposite. It has a bunch of preliminary tremors that result in a larger climax at the end. What the Chinese and Russian scientists noticed was that under Japan and northern Japan, there was first an event with a big boom followed by a tapering, followed by 3 days later or hours later, I don't know exactly how much time separation, but a different event that had a buildup like an earthquake. So it looks like it was a 1-2 punch. And just coincidentally, the Japanese had announced that they were going to accept the Chinese yuan swap facility and work toward a regional currency standard.
Well, Jim, I'm in Japan, and I remember after it happened, something like a week or so later, there was a sporting event in Russia, and there were reports out on the internet that Putin essentially gave a speech there, and he said, you know, how tragic it was that Japan was attacked. And then maybe a month later, there was a sporting event that I have seen the video of, and you can see on YouTube, where there was an ice skating event, and it had a traditional Japanese performance, and it broadcast the seismograph of the whole thing. And a lot of people commented that this seemed incredibly strange. And in it, by the way, the text of the song, the ancient Japanese song, goes along the line of, you know, it's so terrible to face such an attack. And a lot of people, again, commented that in Japanese, you really wouldn't use that kind of phrasing for it. It would be a natural disaster, not a natural attack. So it might have been a message by Putin, essentially saying, look into this and reevaluate who your friends are. Can't prove it, but I'm just saying that's a little tidbit if you're interested.
Oh, I don't lay any blame on the Kremlin for the Japanese nuclear plant events.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a big deal, but a lot of that Yamashita's gold, or Operation Lily is the other word used for it, a lot of that money, I'm sure, is all over, buried in the mountains of Japan or the, you know, bottom of Tokyo Bay or God knows where. And so it's still in play to some extent, and I think that's really messed up their politics in many ways.
I would love to know what portion of the Yamashita gold was stored in the Philippines and what is outside. I would love to know. I'm going to try to find that out. But I tell you that those three sources that I have on the White Dragon gold hoard, they're very tight-lipped. They tell things when they want to. They don't tell things when they're asked. That's not the way it works with them. So, you know, I kind of knock on their door and say, anything you're at liberty to tell me? And then sometimes they throw me a few crumbs at my feet. But I'm grateful.
Well, it's hard to approach some of these people, you know, as you said. They say what they want to say. But anyway, the issue of Asia is a huge one. There's no question. It's the economic development. If you travel around, a lot of Americans don't do this anymore, but if you travel around Asia, you just see tremendous economic progress everywhere.
Yeah, they believe in capitalism. The United States and the West believes in socialism. Capitalism builds capital, builds wealth, starts jobs. Socialism kills wealth, kills capital, and forces unemployment. So we've come full circle. The joke several years ago used to be that the Russians and Chinese are very much devoted to capitalism, which the United States has given up on. We don't even know what capitalism is here. In fact, we got some stupid clowns who believe that the Federal Reserve is printing capital.
Well, come on. The U.S. doesn't have anything resembling free market capitalism. I mean, everything is a cartel, rigged systems, really.
Well, I realize that. I know, but what I'm referring to is a level of ignorance that's astounding, where they believe that the Federal Reserve, by printing money, is printing capital. We don't even know what capital is anymore in the United States. Economists have very little concept of capital. They're very good at telling you the effect on the economy for more handouts.
Hey, Jim, have you ever watched the guy Mark Dice on YouTube with his videos going to people? Like, he would go to them with an ounce of gold, you know, a coin, and say, if you can guess the price within $100, you get it free. Anyway, he would ask for other things, most ridiculous things, but people don't know how many states there are. They don't know who the president is. The list goes on and on of how dumb the public can be.
My favorite is that the capital of Germany is France. That was on a Jay Leno show. It's the same theme. Where's Vietnam? I don't know. It's somewhere in Africa, I think.
Oh, he would do this with starting wars, like, now that we're involved in this war against Iran, should we attack China because China's next to Iran, right? And people say, absolutely, we should, you know, right? And China's a Muslim country too, so they're both bad Muslims, right?
You know, one of the funniest, along the same lines, was a guy on a California boardwalk. might have been Long Beach, I don't know. But he was going from one person to another to get them to sign a petition to eliminate the Bill of Rights. And
that might have been Mark Dice, because he liked to go to the beaches in Southern California. That's an example.
Go ahead.
Well, that's a perfect example. Get rid of the Bill of Rights. One of them, I think maybe did one that we should get rid of elections until President Obama dies, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, well, because I paid attention to the preamble before they signed. He would say, well, the Bill of Rights has been around for like 240 years, 230 years. It's getting a little antiquated, and we really need to update it. So would you like to sign a petition to get rid of it? And a dozen people did. And then finally some guy who looked about 60 said, no, why would I want to get rid of the rights? And then the interviewer said, well, congratulations. You're the first person today to realize this is not a good thing. We live in a land of idiots.
Well, that's the story. So in other words, it's not just that capitalism's falling apart. It's that common sense or education or things like that have kind of fallen apart.
Well, if people want to learn how to become wealthy, what they probably do is sign up for not Section 8. There's a type of housing that's government dependent. If you want to become a millionaire, start a business where the government's your main customer for housing. I mean, it's just incredible. We've lost our concept of capitalism, and our economists have no idea anymore on how to explain what's going on with the economy and the requirements for recovery. They don't know that a recovery comes from more capital formation. It's not from handouts, you economist morons. You don't give more handouts and put money in people's pockets. What a moron concept. You enable them to start businesses, cut back on government regulations and just red tape for company formation, make it easier to borrow money for well-conceived business concepts. No, we have no idea what business is. We have no idea what capitalism is anymore. It's becoming a farce.
Hey,
well,
Jim.
Oh, go ahead, Gigi.
Sorry, I want to go back to the kill-off Anglo banker structure. I know we're running over. And we talked about the taking of actual personnel. But how are they going to do that in the marketplace? Are they playing games where they lure, as you suggested, the bankers, the traders in, the high-frequency traders, and then they come around the back door and take it out from them? And retrieve gold, for instance?
Well,
payment?
I don't have a great answer to that, but I do have something that sheds light. I have one client who's from San Francisco, and in the summer of 2012, we had a few conversations, and he said, Jim, I want to send you a piece of information. It's a list of 965 bankers who've lost their jobs. And I said, okay, are these mid-level bankers? He said, well, there's some vice presidents, there's some executives in there, but it's mostly mid-level bankers, yeah. And I said, so if a bunch of bankers disappear, could they be on this list? And he said, well, I don't know that a whole lot of people would miss the mid-level bankers, so maybe, I don't know. So, when 960 bankers lost their jobs, not a whole lot of people were able to say, well, yeah, I knew 5 of them. They were working with, Citigroup. I didn't know any. And I might have maybe one friend who knows some bankers who lost their jobs. But there are a lot of people who are losing their livelihood, losing their income. And if they were to disappear, would you even know it? So I don't know how these people are being disappeared. I think they're just being taken. They're being arrested by Interpol. I've been told that the White Dragons have hired Interpol. I'm not talking about complete control of Interpol. I'm talking about, the Serious Fraud Division and maybe a couple dozen others who work for Interpol. Interpol is a large organization. There's a criminology laboratory in Nicaragua. It's Interpol. So they're all over the place. I don't know where they're snatching people, and I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what kind of questions, but I know what my agenda would be if I snatched a mid-level banker. I would like to know who has the counterparty risk on all these naked shorts. I would like to know, where did the allocated gold go? What was the destination of improperly taken gold from allocated gold accounts? I would like to know, what are some of the details of the GLD fund and where that gold is going? I would like to know a lot of different things. I would like to know details on, say, fake gold bars that happened under the Clinton-Rubin administration. They not only stole Fort Knox, but they replaced them with fake bars, a lot of them. And a lot of them went to Hong Kong. If you take a look at some of the official trade data and look at details for Hong Kong, you'll see a lot of industrial supplies. That category just sticks out like a big fat sore thumb. I mean, it used to be, like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a month. Well, suddenly it's $1 billion, $1.5 billion a month, $2 billion this month. It's, I think, for reinstatement of fake gold bars.
I heard it got so bad they had to remelt and recast most of the gold that they're importing, Jim.
Well, yeah, but that's to change the identity of where it came from. That's not to get rid of the tungsten. That's to get rid of all the evidence.
Oh, okay.
It's recasting. You take a bunch of GLD gold that has bar numbers, bar lists, all the IDs, and you don't want anyone to find out in the future that it came from GLD improperly. So you take all the bars, you take it to a Chinese or Hong Kong refinery, and you get it recast. And also, they don't like the sizes. They don't like ounces. They like certain sizes. They like 1 kilogram bars and 5 kilogram bars. In the U.S., they like 1,000-ounce bars, which is, I believe, about 60 pounds. That has no metric equivalent. So they're getting rid of the serial numbers and the King's weighting system, the avoirdupois, ounces and pounds and crap like that. Gosh, I'm so embarrassed when I say, well, I can't think in terms of meters. I think in terms of inches. Oh, what are you, stupid? That's what I get here. Let me just think in terms of yards, and I'll just call them meters in my head. But I'm at 83 kilograms. Their scales at the gymnasium, they don't have pounds. So I'm wondering, am I under 180 yet? So I have to convert. It's 81.7. I have to get under 180. I have to get under 81.7 kilograms. So, okay, I can convert, but it gets really tough when you see a price per liter of gasoline and you want to convert it to gallons. It's basically multiply by 4 and then take 5% off. We're antiquated. I think long ago, 200 years ago, some people had a plan to keep the U.S. isolated because they were going to kill it off later.
That statistics training comes in handy, huh?
Well, you got me on the wrong foot there, starting off saying I had an accounting background. I don't know jack about accounting.
Sorry about that.
Statistics. I have a graduate degree, PhD in statistics from Carnegie Mellon, probability in statistics. The thesis topic of the asymptotic distribution of the convex hull of a spherically symmetric random sample. So I am very well versed in statistical modeling, stochastic processes. I used to be in charge at Staples headquarters, in charge of their seasonality calculations. So when the U.S. comes out with their chronically readjusted, seasonally adjusted unemployment, I challenge it with experience and knowledge. We used to have a rule. I was in charge of the seasonality coefficients, which were handled regionally across the U.S. for different, Easter and Christmas was different in Florida compared to New York, so different regions. We had a rule. Don't change your coefficients for seasonality more than once every 3 years. I did one after about 3.5 years. What do they do in the Department of, Bureau of Labor Statistics? Every month, every 2 months, to handle extraordinary events like hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina. No, we handled Hurricane Katrina at Staples. It was called a singular event. And it was a singular event overlaid upon the standard seasonality, which does not change much. So It's how they alter and deceive on price inflation and job creation with crap in there,
Hey, Jim?
constantly adjusted.
Can we get
Crap.
to one last topic? I know we're running a little late here. Here's one question so many people have is, and you're talking about this gold standard. What can people do? What would you suggest for people, particularly for Americans, but I think it's likely to be true for Canadians and many other places as well? Where is your gold safe, or how do you get it from this pre-crisis state to the post-crisis state, or what are your thoughts on that?
I asked some of the smartest and most experienced people that I know the same question. And the answer I get more often than not is Hong Kong. And I also hear Singapore. I never hear London. I never hear Switzerland. I never hear United States. And they don't have any vaults in Latin America. So I used to hear that Dubai was good, but you know, Dubai it's got its problems. The Persian Gulf is not a stable place. I have a general theory that if a certain nation has no respect for the U.S. criminality from the government or the bankers, then that's the best place to put your gold, and that's Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a big victim of the salted tungsten gold bars. Hong Kong is the window to the west for China, not just Shanghai, but Hong Kong. I laughed when people said, "Oh gosh, Hong Kong, it's now communist." What are you, a moron? So I asked some smart buddies who've been over there, what's the legal status? And they said, well, it was a new treaty, a new, what do you call it, commission. They gave it another 50 years. So the British gave them 100, Chinese gave them 50. They didn't change anything. It's their laboratory for learning. So morons can think of Hong Kong as being communist because I think morons remain morons even after subjected to new information.
Well, I was there a couple weeks ago, and I think Hong Kong is a good bet for a lot of things. I do think the mainland Chinese influence is getting stronger and stronger, and so you do hear a lot of complaints about the decline in the rule of law. For example, a friend there has a wife in government, and that's a common complaint. But still, you know, the world's not a perfect place, and I think that's a very reasonable bet. And then a lot of people are also into Singapore, and I don't know enough about that to really comment.
Well, I got only one complaint about Hong Kong, and that's that they got a Hong Kong dollar that's pegged to the U.S. dollar. It's right around 7.76. And when I have 2 or 3 really smart contacts who I pepper with questions every several months. They don't like questions every week, but once in a while they come up and say, "Hey, what's going on?" And we talk, and I say, "I got a few questions if you don't mind." And I asked one, this was back in 2011 when quantitative easing looked like it was going to be obvious, bond monetization, hyper-monetary inflation. I said, look, if Hong Kong is pegged to the dollar and we start, and that's why I asked, why then? I said, if we start this bond monetization, which is Weimar and hyper-monetary inflation, these nations that are pegged are going to have problems. They're going to see things like their stock market go way too high or their property market go out of whack. Is Hong Kong planning to get off the dollar peg? And he said, yes, but they've decided not yet. They have a plan, but they decided not to implement it yet. They're all ready, but they decided not right now. Okay, well, there's part of your answer to my big question. I think the Hong Kong folks are, I mean, I got a friend who went there. He went to Thailand, then he went to Hong Kong, and I said, which did you like better? And he said, well, they're different worlds. Thailand is crazy. Thailand, Bangkok is huge, but so is So is Hong Kong. Hong Kong's 9 million. I think Bangkok is something like 10 million. But you get the crazy bars with the girly boys who have male genitalia, but you don't see any of that in Hong Kong. They're very businesslike. So they're very competent, businesslike, and professional in Hong Kong, and they value their integrity. They value your word as passing on recommendation for their integrity. I keep hearing that from one person after another regarding Hong Kong. I got some misgivings about Singapore. I'd rather not get into all that, but just basically, without getting into the controversial stuff, Singapore does not have a bond depository agreement, which means their bullion gold vaults could get, the managers of the bullion gold vaults could get questions from their government officials on accounts, secrecy, and it would be violated. Singapore does not have that. There's a lot more secrecy and privacy in Hong Kong, from what I hear. And, it's got to be tested. I always think that if enough pressure is put to bear with a little bit of a bribe, and anybody's going to talk, even if they have a lot of integrity. I mean, you threaten to kill some guy's little girl, and he's going to talk.
Sure, but the value to China of Hong Kong is so immense that it's not something they're not going to change policies lightly. Let's just put it that way.
Oh, I agree. I agree completely. I don't ever say never. I don't believe in absolutes.
Well, hey, look, you're down in Costa Rica. Look at Panama. I mean, that's totally changed in the last 20 years, right? I mean, I don't think you can, as an American, you can't even get a bank account there, really.
I heard that you could until right at the end of 2010. Now, there are a lot of Americans who live in Panama, and many of them have bank accounts. And now I believe an American who pursues residence can get, yes, he can get a bank account.
Yeah, of course. That's if you have, a residence.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a fine point, but it's an important point. There are a lot of weird things going on in Panama right now. They're building and setting up a private stage 3 gold depository. Not for the government, not for the Panama government. It's for Europeans who no longer trust Switzerland. Big things are going on in the world. Hey, look, I'm going to have to cut this off. We're at the 2-hour mark here.
Yeah, we've been appreciating your time so much. So, Jim, let's let you get a break, and we thank you again. And what can I say? We appreciate it, and we'll have it up soon. So for us here at the Plain Truth, thanks, Jim. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.